my name is Alexander Dobrinevski. I'm working at the Environment Directorate of the OECD, and I'll speak to you today about some of our work on measuring the consistency of investments and financing with climate objectives. I'll give a brief introduction to this work stream at the OECD, and then I'll speak in detail about an ongoing project, a study of the climate alignment of building investments in the United Kingdom, and I'll give an outlook on how we plan to continue this work in the future. So working on climate alignment is motivated by the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement contains three goals: mitigating climate change, adapting to global warming, and also a third goal specifically on finance, namely making finance flows consistent with a pathway towards low carbon and climate resilient development. And what does that mean to make finance flows consistent with a pathway towards low carbon development? Well, this objective includes not only scaling up aligned flows, which usually go under the name of climate finance, but also reducing or eliminating misaligned flows. And also it encompasses in principle the entire economy. So we need to cover both the financial markets and investment and financing flows in the real economy. And this economy-wide perspective also needs to include both public and private investments and both public and private actors who invest. Let me now say a few words on OECD work on measuring climate alignment in the team where I'm working. So on the one hand, we're trying to provide a platform for actors working on climate alignment so that they can connect, share good practices and methods. On the other hand, we also conduct our own research on the climate consistency of real economy investments. So these are investments in physical assets like buildings or factories, infrastructure, vehicles, and so on. And the idea behind that focus is that physical assets tell you something about current greenhouse gas emissions and also future greenhouse gas emissions that will occur. And also we perceive that there is a research gap in that area a bit, that a lot of initiatives are looking at the alignment of financial assets, financial portfolios, but not so many are looking at the real economy. So for this work, we have collaborated with a number of OECD member countries and their environment ministries. We've looked at what does it mean in practice to evaluate the climate alignment of investments for one particular sector in one particular country. So to that end, we've looked at what data sources are available and what methods can be used to evaluate which investments are aligned and which are not. So for this point, we've looked at a wide range of available reference points for defining climate alignment, some of which you've already heard about in the other sessions of this workshop. So for example, we have looked at the EU taxonomy for sustainable activities, but we've also looked at national climate policy objectives, industry objectives, and other reference points. So clearly not all of these criteria are sufficient to reach Paris Agreement temperature goals, but we also think it's interesting to see and compare the ambition behind the different ways of evaluating climate alignment. So during that work last year, we completed a study on the manufacturing industries in Norway and on the transport sector in Latvia. And currently we have an ongoing project on buildings in the United Kingdom. And this is what I will now present in a bit more detail. This project started in January this year in close collaboration with the UK Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. And we are looking at both residential and non-residential buildings located in the UK. And we are measuring the investments in construction of new buildings and renovation of existing ones. So overall, the building sector plays a very important role for the UK economy. So these construction to renovation investments that we are measuring together, they contribute approximately 40% to the UK gross fixed capital formation. And also the building sector is responsible for almost a third of the UK's greenhouse gas emissions, if you consider direct and indirect emissions together. Finally, a recent analysis by the UK Committee on Climate Change and by the International Energy Agency indicates that the building sector is not on track towards reaching its 2030 climate change mitigation targets, both in the UK and globally, which also motivates studying this in further detail. So one of the aims of our analysis is really to go beyond this aggregate statement that the sector as a whole is not on track and identify more precisely where investments are currently aligned or misaligned. For this, we've gathered a lot of data on both investments and climate performance. So for investments, we started with sector level statistics, but then also complemented them with the transaction level property price data and corporate reports for large actors in that sector. For climate performance, our main data source was a public database of energy performance certificates, which covers most buildings in the UK. And we complemented that also with corporate reports and sector level emission statistics. Combining all that, we then applied several approaches to identify where we can see climate aligned or climate misaligned investments. One simple approach is to categorize investments by the energy performance class. Basically, that's the letter attached to each energy performance certificate between A, which corresponds to the most energy efficient buildings, to G, which corresponds to the least energy efficient buildings. And that's also a useful characterization because the UK has a national climate policy objective of reaching at least EPC class C for most buildings by 2035. And here in this example, you can see how the new construction of residential buildings over the last 10 years breaks down by different EPC classes. Another approach that we applied is evaluating the share of investments that are, that comply with the low carbon buildings criteria of the climate bond standard. So that's an initiative that is coming originally from the financial sector and defines criteria for investments that are eligible to be financed via green bonds. Specifically for buildings, the climate bond standard defines emission intensity thresholds, which depend on the building type and on the location. So in our study, we have applied these thresholds to see what is the share of buildings, of investments that comply with these criteria. What we have found is that actually, here you can see an example for the non-residential sector, that actually there is a significant share of buildings that are not covered by these criteria because the emission intensity thresholds are location specific, and a lot of construction is happening in areas where there is currently no defined emissions intensity threshold in the climate bond standard. For those investments that occur within the scope of the climate bond standard, the majority of the new construction of office buildings in this example is indeed eligible. And another approach that we applied is estimating energy efficiency renovation investments. So we looked at the number of installed energy efficiency measures, in particular insulation and heating measures, and using approximate installation costs, we can attribute approximately 14% of total renovation investments to energy efficiency. And unfortunately, with this approach, we can't really say anything about the other 86%. So we don't really have sufficiently granular data to say which share of these 86% may also be related to climate performance improvements or not. So that analysis would require some further work to really develop, and that's also something that we are discussing with our UK stakeholders. Speaking about future work, let me say a few words on that. So with the 2 studies that we have completed last year and with the ongoing project on UK buildings, we've made some progress along the winding road towards a comprehensive analysis of the climate alignment of investments. So we have now an idea of some steps you have to take along that road. Typically, you would start by collecting some granular data on investments. You can get aggregate investment volumes from national statistics, company reports, but then typically you would need to collect additional data to really distinguish climate relevant categories of investments. And the same then applies also for climate performance. You can get good data on aggregate greenhouse gas emissions from national statistics, company reports, but for some more refined analysis, you would typically need asset level data. Then you need to select which reference points you use to evaluate the climate alignment of investments. And there you have a trade-off between the granularity of a reference point, which really allows you to evaluate the climate alignment of some individual investment project, and some degree of aggregation that you need to connect to country level or global carbon budgets, climate policy objectives, and to the objectives of the Paris Agreement. And bridging this gap between granular project level evaluation and aggregate emission trajectories may require some additional modeling efforts to refine the scenario projections, which are typically done for geographic regions and entire sectors. So our vision for this work is really that we would provide our stakeholders with a toolkit for measuring the climate alignment of investments and financing, ideally for the entire economy. That's not something that the OECD can achieve itself, so we are very much open to collaborating with different organizations to improve and progress this work. That includes both our member countries, but also other public sector, private sector organizations, research organizations. So if you are interested, please do let us know. And yeah, before I end, let me say a few words on what potential next steps we envisage. So we would like to improve the methodology we have used for measuring climate alignment by looking at additional countries, additional sectors, and also by looking at what happens if you go beyond the geographic scope of a single country to understand effects like carbon leakage, for example, which would likely need an analysis of a sector on a global level. We would also like to incorporate some simpler, more timely, and less resource-intensive indicators. And all that, of course, in collaboration with other OECD streams of work, for example, on sustainable finance taxonomies. We would then like also to make use of this climate alignment analysis to inform, for example, the analysis of climate risks in the financial system and in the real economy, and also to inform financing strategies to ensure eligibility of public and private investments for green financing instruments. And finally, we think that it's important to institutionalize such climate consistency analysis on the level of countries and internationally. So we are looking at the ways how this analysis can feed into the process around the 2023 UNFCCC Global Stocktake, and also how we can contribute to existing OECD statistics on climate, for example, in the OECD Green Growth Indicators. So thank you very much. I hope you found this presentation interesting. I'm very keen to hear your questions and comments. As you know, we have a live interactive follow-up discussion scheduled on October 7th. So I'm looking very much forward to exchanging thoughts with you there. Thank you.